Muy buenas tardes, good evening, bienvenidos, and welcome to the Instituto Cervantes, Manchester-Leeds YouTube channel. A very special welcome to our guests, ROSI Song and Tom Whittaker. We are delighted to present the Libris Publications in Spanish Studies, a series coordinated by Professor ROSI Song from the University of Durham, and which aims is to promote the recent publications regarding contemporary Hispanic culture studies in British and American academia. The book we launched today is the Spanish Quinqui film, Delinquency, Sound Sensation by Tom Whittaker, Associate Professor of the University of Warwick. This book was published by Manchester University Press in July 2020. And it is the first major study in English of the cine Quinqui genre, a cycle of popular Spanish films from the late 1970s and early 1980s that shows the real life of juvenile delinquents. The books provides an in-depth analysis and key factors to understand this reality of the Spanish transition and through the films of such directors as Eloy de la Iglesia and José Antonio de la Loma, a social history of those marginal communities whose voices sometimes has not been heard as it should be when we look at the Spain transition to democracy, and especially when the academia analyze this very important moment of the Spanish contemporary history. Our guests will be introduced by Professor ROSI Song, who is a professor and deputy head of the School of Modern Languages and Culture at Durham University. Her field of research focuses on literature, intellectual history, and culture of contemporary Spain. She is the author of Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain, co-author of A Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating, and also the co-editor of Traces of Contamination, Unearthing the Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Disclosure, and also towards a cultural archive of La Movida. Her articles have appeared, among others, in Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, MLN, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, Romance Notes, Hispamérica, Revista Iberoamericana, and Hispania, among others. Finally, you have some questions. You can write them in the chat box, and after the book launch, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers and the dialogue with the author. So, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much for being with us. And without further ado, I give the floor to Professor ROSI Song. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Gracias, Pedro Jesus, for that introduction of Tom and myself. I will just add very quickly before I welcome Tom, who so kindly is joining us tonight, that actually the book that we're going to be discussing today, the Spanish Quinqui film, Delinquency, Sound and Sensation, was actually shortlisted for Best Monograph by BAFS, the British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies. The book was actually published during the pandemic, so it's somehow we weren't there to actually receive it among friends and among our colleagues. So when we were putting together this book series, I thought that I would invite Tom to give him this platform to introduce his book, which I think is a very important addition to the study of not only Spanish cinema, but also the understanding of a very important period in Spanish culture and politics. Welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, Rosie, for inviting me. Thanks also to the Instituto Cervantes for hosting this wonderful initiative. So I'm really happy to be able to talk with you about my book.
Yes, and we were just chatting in the sort of our version of our green room that the pandemic and sort of the way we have lived in the past year makes to seem that this book was written almost in a parallel time, in a time before COVID, And you actually had to slowly come back to this book that you had written before the pandemic, that somehow stopped when it came out, and then we're taking it back again. But before we start with this book, then can we start by actually you giving us a definition of Quinqui that perhaps not everybody's familiar with. So after that definition, can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Sure. Okay. Well, to start off with, okay, the word Quinqui. So to non-Spanish speakers, they hear the word Quinqui and they start thinking of the word Quinqui with a K, K-I-N-K-Y. Well, firstly, it's got nothing to do with that. So Quinqui comes from quinquillero, and quinquillero was a derogatory term that was used to describe mercheros. Mercheros were a nomadic ethnic group that really kind of eked out a living by collecting discarded scrap metal. And so the term Quinqui or quinquillero really evolves in the 1960s and starts to mean something more generic and something different, really. So from the 1960s onwards, you start to hear the word Quinqui, which really starts to signify somebody who lives on the outskirts of the city, who is a lowlife, who's a delinquent. So really kind of Quinqui is very much a kind of product of everything that's going on in 60s Spain, where we're seeing kind of complete urban transformation. We're seeing mass migration from the countryside to the city. We're seeing, on top of that, as part of that process, we're seeing kind of the proliferation of shanty towns, people living in very, very precarious, difficult conditions, and people living in tower blocks, which was Franco's attempt to kind of trying to mitigate the poor housing problems of these people recently arrived in the city. So the term Quinqui from the 1960s starts to mean that kind of like a marginal, low life, always used in a kind of derogatory way, associated with criminality and petty delinquency, if you like. So I think the Quinqui is in that way is the kind of the underside, or the kind of the shadow of Spain's economic miracle, if you like, the desarrollismo of the 1960s.
So how do you bring this topic of Quinqui into your book?
Well, the book really is about cine Quinqui. So cine Quinqui, Quinqui cinema is what I would call a cycle of delinquent-centered or delinquent-themed films that emerged from the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So juvenile delinquency becomes really a major kind of staple of Spanish film production. Films that are directed by José Antonio de la Loma, Eloy de la Iglesia, films with usually quite small budgets, films that are produced very, very quickly. And so Cine Quinqui really is essentially what this book is about. The book provides an overview of these films, but as a way into kind of opening out a window into the Spanish transition, if you like, exploring the kind of social anxieties, the political anxieties during these years from the bottom up, how it was felt by ordinary people. So Cine Quinqui is the theme of this book, but also very, very closely aligned to that is the experience, the lived experience of watching these films. So Cine Quinqui, these weren't the first films that focused on delinquency in Spain, but I think they were the first films that really attracted a teenage audience and had a real kind of fan base of young working class teenagers who lived in the similar kinds of barrios that they saw depicted on the screen, that spoke in the same kind of slang, that listened to the same kind of music. And so there was a real kind of connection between the audiences and the films, and that's very much what I wanted to try and explore in the book as well.
Yes, and I think that we're going to talk a little bit more about that audience because it's quite fascinating. And another thing that I thought in your book is that not only you focus on this topic, but you find a very interesting way of entering or engaging with this material, which is through sound, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about sound a little bit later, but before we get to that, I was thinking a little bit more about your explanation of the significance of the Quinquis or Cine Quinqui in relation to the idea of the Spanish political transformation and so on after the end of the Franco dictatorship. And I was wondering if you could, as a scholar engaging with this topic and with these films, from this where we are right now in the year 2020 and so on, what do you think Quinquis or the Cine Quinqui represent for Spain now, or as a scholar to you as you examine or as you discuss these films?
So what does Cine Quinqui represent to Spanish people now? Well, I think a way into exploring, and it's become a little bit of a cliche thing to say, but to problematize, if you like, the narrative of the transition to democracy as something that was kind of exemplary, that's something that was peaceful. It's become a bit of a commonplace now to kind of interrogate that. But I think, Cine Quinqui provides a perfect kind of platform in order to do that, really, to kind of demythologize, if you like, the transition, but also explore the transition from a perspective of the marginalized, from the perspective of those who didn't have much representation at all. Mm-hmm. So I think this is why it really does resonate with contemporary Spanish audiences at the moment.
So do you think there is a renewed engagement from the Spanish audience's perspective with this film that were produced in the 70s and even up to the 80s?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's part of the whole kind of postmodern recuperation of the recent past, kind of retromania, and the fact that these films have been received increasingly as kind of cult films that have younger audiences now. So absolutely, I think the films continue to live on and continue to find new audiences as they're streamed or as they're downloaded illegally. And you see this, for instance, in the kind of trap or the rap Quinqui of El Coleta, for instance, who very kind of self-consciously homages many of the kind of audio-visual icons of Cine Quinqui and his music videos, for instance. So I really do think that it kind of resonates also in terms of, the socio-economic climate as well, particularly since the crisis of 2007, 2008, high levels of youth unemployment rather, that very much kind of mirrors, the economic or the socio-economic backdrop at the beginning of Cine Quinqui. So, 1973, you see the end of Spain's economic miracle. You see rates of unemployment shoot up. And on top of that, you've got a baby boom. So you've got a fertility boom of all of the people who were kind of born in the early 1960s coming of age. So you've got a youth unemployment crisis when we get to the late 1970s. Right. And it's that kind of unemployment that is depicted unflinchingly and critiqued often in the films.
Right. So thinking about, you know, the living on of these films, as you mentioned about that cult audience and so on. Oh, can we think a little bit or talk, or maybe you can explain a little bit more for our audience today to understand how commercially successful these films were when they were made back when?
Well, they were commercially successful, but many of them were exhibited in cines de barrio, okay, so neighborhood cinemas, kind of shown continuously throughout the day. So they reached many audiences, but they never really had the kind of institutional commercial success that you might compare with, like, say, for instance, the film El Crack, which would be, a similar kind of time period. So yeah, they were films that really kind of resonated with audiences, rather than films that I would say were, #1 commercial hits. That said, I mean, films like, Deprisa, which was directed by Carlos Saura. So Carlos Saura, who was, as everyone knows, associated with art cinema, Spain's #1 auteur in the late 1970s, early 1980s. His film Deprisa, when that came out in 1981, was by far his most commercially successful film to date.
Sorry. So that is that commercial success, but I wanted to go back to what you described in the way that these films were screened and played in the cines de barrio. And I think that you do discuss the context this screening create, right? The audience, the way that audience participates in watching this film, and sort of the environment that this creates in watching the films, but also in terms of the sensation and the sound engagement of audience and film. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one thing that really struck me when I was doing the research for this book was the amount of eyewitness, or rather I should say ear witness, accounts of the noise that came out of the auditoria in several of the kind of premieres of these Quinqui films. That there were several accounts of young audiences shouting, booing whenever a policeman comes on screen, cheering whenever a delinquent outwits the police. So there was really a sense of, the soundscape of the cinema auditorium being very, very important. And somehow this led me to start thinking, well, actually sound is not just a peripheral thing. It's not just one dimension of many in these films. I think, sound is perhaps one of the most important things. And that's why I started to kind of conceive of the book around the importance of sound. So the soundscape of the auditorium was very important, I think. So it kind of really created that resonance between the film and the audience, and also, because the audiences themselves started speaking like, the actors, and they started listening, like I said before, to the type of rumbas, to the, gypsy bands like Los Chunguitos, Los Chichos. Many of their songs are, integral parts of the soundtracks of these films, and they start listening to these soundtrack albums as well. I've forgotten what was your original question there. You asked me about
so that interaction between watching the film and the sound produced by the audience, right? Sort of that interaction, shouting back at the screen. And I think that you explained it very well, sort of in that soundscape that it creates. Perhaps you like to define what you understand by soundscape a little bit, but I take it from your explanation that the sound sort of landscape that these created in their interaction that later is continued, right, in their own lives, because people the fans actually do listen to the soundtrack. They are seeking this kind of sound that they hear in these films as well. But interesting also to think about soundscape as part of what you are studying or discussing in this film. So can you explain a little bit more about like soundscape as a definition that you bring into cinema studies, but also the way you actually connect this idea of sound with deviance in the context of the book?
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the second question, and then hopefully that will allow me to discuss the first. So the relationship between sound and deviance. Well, firstly, you know, the soundtrack. Sound is really a way for the delinquents to kind of articulate their deviance, their transgression, their resistance, if you like, through the slang, through the use of the music, through the rumbas. So through this kind of creation of noise, as this kind of unwanted sound, or a good description of noise. I can't remember who wrote it. It's in the introduction. But so the definition of noise as being a sound out of place. So the sound really becomes, a way of articulating their marginality. But at the same time, sound becomes a way not only to kind of mark out their deviance and transgression, but to establish community, to establish kinship and closeness. This is something that I explore as well in the book, how kind of within the soundscape of the cinema auditorium, you have this kind of auditory, this sonic community that's formed between the film and the audience that I think is important. It's something that I explored throughout the book. So I guess one of the questions that the book asks is, why is sound important and what does sound do? How does it kind of stimulate this response in the audiences? And also, how do these films stimulate a response within society? Because many of these films triggered a whole series of debates, debates surrounding the problem of heroin abuse or housing or the problems of penal reform.
Yeah, and I actually really like your discussion about that idea of sound as out of place, but also its relationship with the home, right? That noise that invades the home, the same way as perhaps a crime, right, interrupts that peaceful or whatever safe space that you think of when you think of the home. So let's talk a little bit about deviancy and delinquency, because the actors involved in these films, that's quite another story. And you actually do tell very entertainingly a lot of these stories. So can you recover some of those stories for our audience? Like, who were these actors? What sort of following or fandoms did they have? Their constant, let's say, encounters with the law and so on?
Well, okay, let me see if I could. I'll try to remember. So, the first, if you like, or the most important Quinqui film that really kind of provides the blueprint of all of the films that come afterwards, Perros Callejeros. So this film, which was directed by José Antonio de la Loma, this was supposed to be starring a 15-year-old delinquent who was infamous, known as El Vaquilla, so Juan José Moreno Cuenca. And so he was supposed to be in the film, but just as they started the production of the film, the youth courts intervened, and they said that he can't feature in the film because he has to make regular appearances at youth court. So what this meant was that his friend, more kind of like frenemy, they were friends, but they were always kind of arguing with each other, Ángel Fernández Franco took his role instead, much to his consternation. And so Ángel Fernández Franco takes on the role of El Torete, and so then appears in 3 of Jose Antonio La Loma's films, and becomes the first kind of Quinqui star, if you like. Another story, so Deprisa starred a real-life delinquent from Villaverde in Madrid. So Jose Antonio Valdelomar, I think his name was, and he was unable to attend the premiere of the film because he had just been arrested for his involvement in a bank robbery. And of course, it was very much, life following art, because in the film, just a few months earlier, he's filmed robbing a bank. And he was arrested by Juan Antonio González Pacheco, so Billy the Kid, Billy el Niño, and so there are all kind of reports about him being mistreated and tortured in the police cell. And when he was arrested, he was actually carrying the contract of the film that he'd kind of co-signed with the director, Carlos Saura, and the producer, Elias Querejeta. So it's those kind of uncanny, anti-mimetic blurrings of art and life that are just so kind of entertaining and surprising when you kind of read into the backstories of these Quinqui films.
Yeah, so a lot of actors coming in and out of the prison system,
yes,
sort of the treatment that they received. Those were really interesting stories that you weave into your film analysis. But one of the things that you actually do in that sense, sort of paying attention to the actors behind these films, is sort of understanding, or at least highlighting, the delinquent voice. So how do they get to say, what are they saying? Why were you interested in thinking about that voice?
Well, firstly, because I think that in the history of Spanish film, these voices had very, very rarely been heard. So this is the first time that delinquents were speaking as themselves. And often, I mean, there are kind of reports of directors actually asking the delinquents to kind of rewrite parts of the script to make sure that it sounded kind of fresh and authentic. As with many of Spanish films in the 70s and 80s, many of the Quinqui films use post-sync sound, but some did use direct sound. So Yo el Vaquilla and Deprisa use direct sound, so sound which is recorded on location, and this really gave a kind of documentary style kind of realism to the films, and also kind of grounded their voices into kind of place, into the kind of the geographical context of the police cells, the barrios where they would be hanging out. So I thought voice was very important, and also because in terms of narrative and point of view. So unlike most crime films that are recounted or focalized through the perspective of the investigator or the police, these are films that foreground the consciousness of the delinquents. So what it does, it emphasizes their subjectivity through vocal expression. So I think something about the vocal performance, the style of vocal performance, the style of slang that you hear, that is unprecedented in history of Spanish film. And in fact, I mean, I draw upon all kinds of accounts of journalists who are kind of quite shocked to hear the way that they were speaking in some of these early Quinqui films. So I think that's important, and I think you can draw a parallel to the way in which in the early 1930s American audiences heard for the first time through direct sound, through synchronized sound, the kind of slang coming from Chicago, from, you know, in the films with James Cagney, all of the kind of the gangster films as well. So there's a kind of similar kind of parallel there, I think.
Yeah, and actually one of the surprising things, and obviously it makes absolute sense, but that I didn't realize was in your discussion of the language that they use, the slang, right? And I could see that you had to do a lot of learning of this slang language. You can tell us a little bit about how you build that vocabulary, but how it had to change. That slang was also very dynamic because these delinquents or these youth had to change their form of communication as to be always a step ahead, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, just, I mean, exactly what you just said. The language was just very, very creative, very shape-shifting. The words took on new meanings, and so that they went undetected, really. So it became, what it did was, again, drawing on this concept of the auditory community, this sonic community that so outsiders can't understand, but so it kind of creates this very strong sense of kind of a sonic bubble. So yes, that's something that I try and trace, and that was quite challenging. And then I kind of pick out key scenes from films which illustrate that.
Yeah, you could imagine that the police also went to see this film just to understand, you know, learn that language.
Yeah, I think
they had to create another set of terms, right?
Yeah, I think they did. Yeah.
That's really interesting. But actually, one of the things that you said about, you know, thinking about film cycles, and perhaps you can take a couple of steps back and think about the Quinqui phenomenon or about these film in some more general context. You do refer, or at least the way you explain about Quinqui films, you put in the context of film cycles. Produced for very specific demographics. And you think about, in the context of the US, films created for a teenage demographics, the gangster films, or the teenager pictures of the 1950s, or the blaxploitation films. How do you connect Quinqui films with these older film cycles? Or what's the use, actually, of these film cycles?
What's the use? Okay, so trying to remember my argument here. It's been a while. So yes, so what I try to do is I'm trying to argue against, I guess it's not that important, really. I don't think, you know, I don't think it's terribly productive to get lost into, you know, questions of taxonomy and classifying films. That's never really interested me as a film scholar. But what I do try to do is kind of question whether cine Quinqui can be considered a genre, because for me, it's more of a kind of cycle, yeah. And film cycles usually last 5 or 10 years, whereas genres are kind of more perennial, and they last for decades and decades. They evolve, obviously they respond to different kind of social historical conjunctures, but you know, they're more perennial and more eternal in a way. So what I was trying to do was to draw a parallel between cine Quinqui as a film cycle that was short-lived, in the same way that many of the kind of American film cycles were short-lived, such as, you know, as you mentioned, blaxploitation. And similarly, many of these film cycles were also critically maligned. Okay, so these were films that weren't taken seriously by the critical establishment at the time. And there were films that were often had kind of quite deviant or shocking or sensationalist styles and subject matters. And so that's how I kind of try to seek to find a broader kind of industrial context, if you like, for cine Quinqui.
Yeah, and I think actually those contexts are important, right? Because it does provide sort of a background to understand this kind of film that is not so local and so national, right? And speaking about those connections, when we talk about Quinqui films and we talk about the Quinquis, we do think about youth, right? Youth culture. How do you think the Spanish youth culture actually connects to other youth cultures? Like, for example, UK British youth culture has been much studied, discussed, and so on. Is there any connection? Do you see any way of discussing this youth culture in both contexts, or perhaps thinking in other contexts as well?
I don't know. I mean, one thing I do try to emphasize is that obviously, Cine Quinqui, juvenile delinquency wasn't only a Spanish phenomenon, particularly in the late 1970s, early 80s, you see juvenile delinquency as a theme in all kinds of films. British cinema, for instance, films like Quadrophenia, Jubilee, films that celebrate kind of subcultures. So the 70s and 80s really is the time for the celebration of subcultures in many kind of Western societies. So I think that, Cine Quinqui can be seen alongside all of these other kind of subcultures that are taking place and developing in other countries. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but I think that one of the things that, for example, and I think that you and I have discussed in the past. So, for example, when we talk about La Movida, or sort of as an underground culture, and we think about La Movida in such a Spanish terms, right? As if it was very disconnected from anything else that was going on. Yet, if you actually think about that moment, a lot of the Spanish youth that were participating or being part of that movement were actually very exposed to British culture or American culture and so on, right? Perhaps the Quinqui are not in that same category, but thinking about the way youth cultures were reacting against social condition or against authority and so on. Are there any sort of similarities, for example, what's happening in the 70s in the UK and in Spain, for example?
So, I mean, you could argue that the Movida is more of a kind of counterculture, and that, the Quinquis were more of a subculture, if you like. And the Quinquis are very much part and parcel of this kind of new consumerism, this conspicuous consumption that we see holding sway in Spain in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. So yeah, I would define them as a subculture. I would also, the film really, the book really does explore how they reveal the kind of contradictions of the historical moment, and these contradictions, these material circumstances, these are uniquely Spanish. So they're coming about at a time when Spain is coming out, although not fully, from an authoritarian dictatorship. Yet the penal code, the fascist penal code, still remains in place until 1995. So you've got this kind of tension between this desire for freedom, for speed, for movement, consumption on the one hand, but on the other hand, you've got this kind of straitjacket of authoritarianism, a penal system that is still very much rooted in the 1940s. Police torture, abuse going well into the 1980s. So you've got this tension that is quite unique, I think, to the Spanish context.
So that context, seen from our vantage point of the present, has that acquired other signification, or is that much more used to gain a better understanding of the time? I mean, thinking a bit about sort of the revival, perhaps, of the Quinqui films?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see how more contemporary audiences have kind of resonated with these films, as I discussed earlier, and the parallels that can be drawn out with the socio-economic situation as well. So yes, I think that kind of time lag allows you to really get to grips with the kind of the historical situation more fully, I think.
Yeah. So I'm going to, before I ask my last questions, I want to alert our audience to get ready to ask your questions. Please use the chat feature, start typing your questions, or if you want to participate with your direct voice, please feel free to unmute yourselves and join in when we open the questions. So as you get ready, I'm going to ask my last question.
Sure.
Coming back to perception and crime and sound, I was very fascinated about that discussion of the relationship between these films that seem to portray reality, and how actually these films seem to distort people's perception of what was going on. So in terms of crime rate, so the idea that the 70s were such a dangerous time, right? And how people perceived their own safety. But you actually make a case that these films, while depicted a certain situation, they were not actually quite reflective of that, right? Can you explain a little bit of what you were researching?
Well, I think it depends on the type of film. So, I mean, first of all, so one thing that I explore in the book is how, particularly in the late 1970s, Spain develops what I call a crime consciousness. So it's the first time that we see, crime rates being published. We see the first kind of carrying out victim surveys. So crime becomes a big topic in the media. It also becomes, as you can imagine, amplified and sensationalized, particularly by the right. And the right-wing press often go back again and again to the theme of delinquency as a kind of symptom and a symbol of everything that is going wrong with, a permissive or ostensibly permissive democratic state. So, delinquents therefore become, chivo expiatorio, so blamed for everything, if you like. So I think that some Quinqui films, so those directed by Ignacio Iquino, who was very reactionary, very opportunistic, and had been making films since the 1940s, and just basically saw an opportunity to make some money because he was like, oh, right, okay, this is what they're doing in Barcelona, I'm going to make this type of film. So his films are very reactionary and very much kind of depicted delinquents as these kind of marauding, very, very aggressive, dangerous individuals. Other treatments, such as those by Eloy de la Iglesia, were much more celebratory, so kind of really very much emphasized the kind of resistance and the struggle of the delinquents. So it very much depends on the kind of the politics, the ideology of the director in question.
Yeah. So let's thank you so much for that, and let's open the questions actually for from our audience. And I already see that there's some side conversations going on. Somebody, Cristina, actually commented that we could think about a revival que podría ser con los poligoneros, and actually Santi Fos Hernandez comments that actually about polygoners, we do have a film, which is Vigas de la Luna, Juani de Vigas de Luna, Vigas Luna from 2006. So we have a couple of questions in the comment section. So I'm going to start with Timothy Palmer's one. It says, he says, I see on Google that 8 years after Perros Callejeros, there was a film called Perras Callejeras. Would you speak to the role of the female delinquent in Cine Quinqui? Excellent question.
Sorry, it just cut out. What the question was?
Would you speak to the role of the female delinquent in Cine Quinqui?
Well, yes. I mean, the role of the female delinquent in Cine Quinqui, unfortunately, it's often not very fleshed out. They're there often as a kind of object of titillation. Several of the films are quite misogynistic. There is, I mean, I'd say an exception to that is the role of Ángela, who was played by Berta Socollamos in Deprisa. So her performance is really quite interesting. And I think she's perhaps the kinky character who has perhaps the most agency. It gives a very kind of mysterious and very introspective performance in that film. But yes, the kinky cinema is, I guess, a very, very masculinist cycle of films.
Yeah, the film, I don't know if I got cut off before you heard it, but Timothy was actually mentioning the film Perras Callejeras that came out after Perras Callejeras.
Yeah. So I mean that film is it's a spin-off. It's not a great film, but yeah, I don't really talk about the film that much in my book. But yes, so that was from 1985. And that was coming towards the end of the cycle.
So we have another question from Paul Smith, Paul Julian Smith. He says, thanks, Tom. Looking forward to reading the book. A note on reception in the US. Just out on DVD is Eloy de la Iglesia's Quinqui collection from exploitation cinema label Severin. A question. How do you read the incongruous music in a film like El Pico, where there is a Brazilian song, Ciudad Maravillosa, and weirdly jolly instrumental music at the end? My students are always surprised by the soundtrack in the film. And P.S. I attended a screening of De la Iglesia's El Diputado on its release in 1978 in a huge cinema in Bilbao, and the audience, perhaps shocked, were totally silent.
Wow, okay. So firstly, the DVD collection, yes, I have that. In fact, I'm supposedly, I think I'm even in it. I'm speaking in the interviews in one of the extras, but I've not been able to listen to it because it is Region 1 and my DVD player won't play it. But yeah, I think Paul Julian Smith is in with Alejandro Melero interviewed for that as well. So the question about El Pico, well, yes, Eloy de la Iglesia makes some quite strange aesthetic choices with regards to music often. I think, he's quite tin-eared often. I don't know. I've always found that music, the Brazilian one, really quite random as well. The jolliness is very, very incongruous. I don't really know. I can't really say much more about that. And yes, right. Thank you for sharing the memory of the 1978 screening of El Diputado. Yeah, there were kind of very, very shocked screenings also of El Pico as well, where the auditorium was actually silent with utter kind of shock as well for that film too.
Great. Actually, if you do need to play that DVD, Tom, just send it to me. I have ripper, so
Oh,
I can help you listen to your own voice here. Do we have any questions? Any other questions?
Get some water.
If not, while Tom is getting his water, I wanted to thank you everyone for being here. And just to remind you that our next series is actually with Álvaro Santana Acuña, and we're going to be talking about 100 Years of Solitude and how it was made into a bestseller. So Tom, going back to your book, while I think, Sarah, are you going to ask a question? No, okay, because I saw you on video. One of the things that perhaps we can talk a little bit about, and I was actually fascinated, was the life or the role that rumba plays in this. So not only the popularization of these groups, right? But also the soundtrack becoming very popular, and also again appearing in these raps more recently. What was sort of your following of that relationship between these sounds and these films?
Well, so these rumbas are very important, and you can explore them in several ways. So first of all, the question of mobility, because and the recent invention of the radio cassettes, because many of these delinquents were listening to these songs on cassette, these rumbas on cassette, in cars, often stolen cars. So the act of listening becomes a kind of transgressive in its own right. Also the importance of mobility in terms of the migratory routes of the singers of these bands, Los Chichos, Los Chunguitos, who were rural to urban migrants, combining kind of elements of, flamenco with more kind of poppy Anglo-American sounds via kind of Barcelona, because of the importance of the history of the rumba in Barcelona. What they do really is kind of articulate this relationship of mobility, not only the migratory routes, the cassette as a sonic object in itself, and how these songs make constant appearances in the films, both diegetically, non-diegetically, and then they become a thing that the audiences take home with them because they're the soundtrack albums that were released on cassette as well.
Yes, and now when they appear in raps, I mean, do they appear as objects? Are there, musical quotations? What are they?
Well, El Coleta, his music videos, for instance, they're all on YouTube, so it's all kind of streamed. But that said, he's fascinated with the materiality of 70s and 80s culture, the kind of analog, the analog dimension of it. And so he's released many of his kind of Quinqui rap albums on vinyl, and with, pictures that gestured back towards the imagery of many of the scenes from Quinqui films. So yeah, he's trying to kind of convey that the material importance of these objects and the emotional importance of these objects to the listeners.
Yes, I actually have to say that while I was reading your book, I had to go Google Los Chunguitos to hear some music while I was getting in the in the mood to read that chapter. It was very good. Do we have any questions from our audience? If not, no questions. I'd like to thank Tom for sharing his work with us today for an hour. I know how exhausting this is, staring at the video and and me badgering you with questions. So well done, Tom. And perhaps we could host a cycle of Quinqui films at the Instituto Cervantes, Pedro Jesus, at some point, and actually.
Yes, that is a great idea. Maybe we can organize a session, a series, because it's something so important. And I think in the interview was clear, these relations between popular music, rumba, and all these social questions and problems that you have very well analyzed. So that would be great, I think. So we will think about it to show a series of Quinqui films that I am sure that will be, the people will be very interested, because it's something, as you say, Tom, very unique of Spain also.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosie and Tom. I like it very much, and I think also our audience. And as you mentioned, the next book launch will be on the 7th of December about García Márquez with Álvaro Santa Cuña. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Bye.
Thank you. Good to see you.